Throughout our 120 years, Ford has supported our nation's armed forces and honored their selfless service to our country. The Central Ohio Ford dealers are proud to continue this tradition by investing in the work of the National Veterans Memorial and Museum in Columbus. Together, we want to share the veterans' heroic stories and introduce a grateful nation to the faces behind our forces. Please join us this year to hear inspiring educational stories from our veterans who have gone above and beyond their call to defend freedom around the world. The National Veterans Memorial and Museum and your Central Ohio Ford dealers. Together, we will never forget.
Hello and welcome to May's Inspiring Story of Service here at the National Veterans Memorial and Museum. May is Mental Health Awareness Month, and today we have U.S. Army veteran Katie Kopp joining us to share her story. Katie is a clinical psychologist who worked for the U.S. Army from 2007 to 2013 and was deployed twice to Afghanistan as the Brigade Psychologist with the 4th Brigade Combat Team, 4th Infantry Division, also known as the Mountain Warriors. Upon her return to the States, Katie served another 5 years as a government civilian at Fort Carson, Colorado. Today, Katie works for the Department of Veteran Affairs as a psychologist, helping veterans work through their combat trauma and helping them cope with moral injuries. So, Katie, before we discuss your work with the Department of Veteran Affairs, let's start off with your service as a brigade psychologist. Why did you decide to serve, and what does it mean to you?
I think everybody, including myself, was surprised when I joined the Army. It was not something that had really been on my radar. Nobody in my family had served. I didn't have any close friends who had served. I didn't really know anybody who had been in the military that I was close to. So I was already in graduate school to become a clinical psychologist. And a couple of people in the years ahead of me in the program had joined the Army through the Health Professionals Scholarship Program, HPSP. And so it was a good, really financial investment. So I'd like to say, I had the most honorable intentions, a lifelong dream of service. That isn't quite true. I really needed money for school because it was real expensive. But we were already engaged in 2 wars when I joined. I commissioned in 2005, around the same time that I got my master's degree. And so then the Army picked up the tab for my last couple of years of graduate school. And then I went on active duty in 2007 for my internship. So I tell people I joined mostly for the money, but I stayed because I really appreciated it and felt really passionate about the mission of taking care of soldiers' mental health. So I stayed a couple of years past what I was obligated to. Yeah.
You joined for the money, but stayed for the service. Part of our storytelling entity of the museum is talking about why did people join? What pulled them to serve? So talking about that, can you share with us your experience helping soldiers in the battlefield, and what's the importance of maintaining your mental health before, during, after stressful or traumatic situations? Because I know you were personally and professionally involved in a lot of that as you were deployed.
Being an Army psychologist, there's a lot of different ways and places you can serve in that role. In a hospital, in a unit that is not currently deployed. And so the benefit that I had of, I was a brigade psychologist for 5 years in the same unit, which is a ton of longevity that most people don't get to have in one unit. So the first time I got there was kind of right before we left for Afghanistan. So I didn't really get the full training cycle. I got there, and then a couple months later, we went downrange. And then I went through the whole cycle of coming back with them, going to Afghanistan again, coming back with them. So I got to see over time, how leaders really bought into the doctrine and the importance of taking care of soldiers' mental health. I wouldn't say maybe as equal plane with physical fitness, but they definitely, really understood that mental fitness was also extremely important. And I was so fortunate to serve under a couple of brigade commanders and other leaders who just really appreciated that message and passed it on down. So when we were downrange, my goal was to be present in as many places as possible, which was a little challenging because our brigade, you get spread out over various smaller bases, larger bases. And so I had about maybe a dozen locations that I would try to kind of rotate through. So I spent a lot of time traveling, mostly by helicopter, a little bit on the ground as well, just trying to get to see everybody. Because what I didn't want to do was just show up when something bad happened, because I think it's really hard to establish trust and rapport like in the moment when something terrible has already happened. So I tried to at least be visible as much as possible, but then I would respond in the aftermath of trauma. And usually that then involved kind of meeting with the group that had been kind of closely involved in the incident. So usually like platoon size elements, kind of meet with them as a group and then be available for a couple of days at least afterwards for anybody who wanted to seek any individual therapy as well. In that environment, we're not really, I don't want to say we're not worried about diagnosis, but it doesn't matter because we're just trying to make sure that I'm doing everything that I can to help them process the experience and prepare to continue to do their job. Because, deployments can be kind of long and there's a lot of different things that happen. And so we just want to do everything we can to maintain resilience. So before the deployment, they did some kind of battle mind training, I think they called it, where we're really just trying to help people understand, like I said, the importance of attending to their mental health, learn some breathing and relaxation strategies, things that they can use when things get hard. And then when we're downrange, we're kind of in the middle of it. So you're doing everything you can to get through day to day. Some really hard things happened. And so we're, attending memorial ceremonies and helping people learn how to grieve well, because not everyone has experience with that, at the same time that you're really keeping your mind on the mission and moving forward. And then, like I said, I had, the benefit of being through 2 full deployment cycles with the same unit. So then we get back and again, they're seeing me. They're like, oh, you were down, you were over there with us. And I'm like, I am. And now I'm in Colorado with you. And so I did a lot of post-deployment health assessments and then just provided a lot of therapy in the meantime. And then we went right back into the same preparations for the next deployment.
How many psychologists did the Army have over in Afghanistan or Iraq? Can you talk about that, or do you even know?
Yeah, I don't think I could ballpark a number, but I can just tell you generally what the structure was. So it really was right when I got assigned to my unit that this was becoming a thing, that they were like assigning people to the unit, as opposed to before that, all the medical assets were assigned to hospitals, and then they would just kind of pluck one here or there when they needed one to go overseas. So then this was like a whole like doctrinal shift where we were embedded in the unit. So that probably really started happening around 2008, 2009. 2009 was when I got to 4th Brigade in Colorado. So I was, in my first deployment, I was the only one assigned to my brigade. So I'm like wearing, the unit patch of the 4th Infantry Division. And then when we got in Afghanistan, there were combat stress control assets. So the Army has some combat stress control units. I think a couple active duty and then more in the reserves. And so then that whole unit might deploy and then get spread out over the country. Where we happen to be, we got supplemented by Air Force assets. So I had an Air Force psychiatrist and then a social worker that were in our brigade's AO. And so they would help cover down on stuff too. And, the prescribed medications, which I wasn't able to do. So throughout the whole country, so the units are going to have kind of organic assets, and then there's going to have these other combat stress control assets sort of spread around. So, at any given time, I really have no idea how many of us there were, because I just kind of know what was happening in like my part of the country. But like I said, in our AO, there was essentially 3 of us. Me and 2 Air Force, and then our enlisted techs too, who are unbelievably valuable in assisting with our duties downrange.
So let's talk about your transition out of the Army and what was that like? And then when did you make that decision to work for the Department of Veteran Affairs?
Yeah, It's funny because I feel like my transition, well, it might still be happening. I mean,
Right.
it felt like I was really taking like baby steps. I mean, obviously there is a day where you're wearing a uniform, and then there's a day when you have a DD-214 in hand and you're not wearing a uniform. So that does happen, at once. But in terms of kind of emotionally, geographically, like it was a much slower process for me. Part of it too is that I was also transitioning into motherhood. I had my daughter, kind of took my maternity leave into my terminal leave, and then left active duty with a newborn in hand. And then I had about 6 months or so of just the slow hiring process to become a Department of Defense civilian. So I went from active duty Army Brigade Psychologist to DoD civilian on the embedded behavioral health team. So I actually just moved to a different brigade and was responsible for an infantry battalion as a civilian, which means you don't go on the training exercises, you don't go down range, but when they're back in garrison, you're kind of responsible for that unit. So that for me still felt very good and very familiar of like, okay, I'm responsible for this battalion. So anybody from this battalion that comes into the behavioral health clinic, like I'm responsible for them. And so I got to know the battalion commander and the company commanders and the first sergeants, and got to really, again, build that level of trust where they say, okay, when she gives us a recommendation for one of our soldiers, we know that she knows what the mission is and that she wouldn't, pull somebody off duty unless they really needed to be. So that was kind of step one, is like moving into being a DoD civilian. And so I stayed at Fort Carson, where I had been on active duty for 5 years. And then I stayed as a civilian for another 5 years. And then in 2019, a position opened up at the VA clinic in my hometown. And so that was a little too hard to resist, returning home and being around family. And because we had great friends and kind of chosen family when we were living in Colorado, but nothing beats, having all of my kids' grandparents right there and available to help us when we needed it. And so that's what brought us back to Iowa, like I said, in 2019. So that's where we've been since then. And I'm working for the VA, and it's really cool because I do get a huge variety. I have seen patients from 19 years old to 96 years old and everybody in between. And when I was leaving Fort Carson, a lot of my patients were very young, like 19, 20.
Right.
They were like, oh yeah, you're like my mom's age. And I'm like, oh, thanks. And then I got to the VA, and all these Vietnam vets were like, I don't know, you're just a baby. I don't know if I can talk to you. So.
Well, I'm curious if you could share with us about how you got into psychology, or what is it about that field that really drew you in? And what does it mean to you being a psychologist?
Yeah, I wish I had a better understanding of my own self and why I got into this field in the beginning. I mean, just really honestly, as long as I can remember, I've kind of been saying this is what I thought I was going to do. Initially I thought I would be a psychiatrist. So I thought I was going to go to medical school, and work in that side of mental health. And then during my undergraduate time, I decided to kind of pivot away from that, and so I did a psychology undergraduate major, and then went right into my doctorate program from there. So, I mean, the nice thing about being a psychologist is you have a ton of options to work within the field. You can teach, you can do clinical work, you can do administrative stuff. There's lots of options within the field. But I feel so passionate about kind of being in the trenches in a way, I guess, to use a war metaphor. But, I do therapy all day, every day. And maybe at some point I'll want a little more variety in terms of how I spend my time. But I also feel like, as one of very few combat veterans on staff at my hospital, that brings just a different level of knowledge to what I can bring to patients. And some veterans, only want to talk to somebody who they feel like has been there. So I guess I have that kind of street cred that I get to bring to any initial encounter.
Right. So I'm curious about what advice that you would give to those listening and watching today about their struggles with their mental health, their recommendations about who they can reach out to?
I would say don't quit. And I mean that in every sense of the word. Obviously, veteran suicide is a huge concern. I would never want, it was hard enough losing brothers and sisters downrange. I don't want to lose any brothers and sisters here where help is available. So obviously, if at any point anybody feels like they're in crisis, you should go to the emergency room. You should call a battle buddy. You should dial 988, press 1 for veterans. Please get help if you feel like you are at that point. If you're just kind of struggling either with transition into civilian life or, as things go on, an analogy that I use for a lot of people is like, you might have, I don't know, like a wellness puzzle, where these are all the pieces that have to kind of fit together for you to feel like you are living a life worth living, and that you have, task and purpose in your day-to-day life. And not everybody's puzzle looks the same, so all the different things, there's exercise, there's social connection, it could be therapy, it could be medication, it could be meditation. It's all the different stuff. Maybe it is time with family, maybe it's staying away from family. It can look different for everybody, but so you have to kind of figure out, like, what does this look like for me, and how big do these individual pieces need to be? For some people, like, exercise is like a fourth of their puzzle. They're like, I have to punish my body. I need to go to jiu-jitsu and throw people around. I need to run. I need to do Murph until I'm going to vomit. Like, they really want to push themselves. And that feels like when they do that, they feel good. And then for other people, they're like, I need to stay in therapy. Like, I need to at least, once a month or once a week, I need to talk to somebody. And I know that I need that for me to feel good. So it's all going to vary person to person, and it can shift over time as well. Sometimes you might feel like you need a bunch of people around you, like you really need to be socially connected. And then there might be other times where you say, I actually need to withdraw from people, and I need to be more reflective for a little bit. I need to spend some time focusing on having gratitude and appreciating the beauty of things around me. I want to go for a 10-mile solo hike on a Saturday, and that's going to be the thing that's going to help me feel better. So I think there are traditional mental health paths, there are complementary mental health things that happen, and then there are just other activities. If somebody tells me, I'm in the Midwest, right? So I've got a ton of guys who are hunting and fishing. You're not going to see me from October to February. I'm like, okay, come back in February when you're done, killing deer, and we'll pick back up with therapy again. So whatever it takes for people to feel better, but don't give up. And same thing even with seeking treatment. If you get a therapist and you have zero connection, it just feels like I cannot talk to this person, I cannot trust this person, it's okay to try again and try a different therapist, whether within the VA. There's lots of, you can use your health insurance. There are other nonprofits that offer mental health services to veterans. So there's a lot of options. And so it's just important to, like I said, don't give up. Keep exploring until you find what works for you.
Well, Katie, before we wrap up, I'm gonna throw you a curveball. We'll see if this makes it into our story. But some people may know that we met about 6 months ago, or actually 7 months ago, when we had our Fall Veteran Voices program focusing on the Outpost, based on the book by Jake Tapper and the film by Rod Laurie. Part of the film was portrayal by an actress that relates directly to you. How do you feel when you see that and you're like, I'm glad that this was part of the film because we wanted to put this in, or is it I don't want to be a part of this, but yes, it's something we should talk about. I'm curious as to what you thought about that.
I think the more visibility on mental health, the better. Obviously May is Mental Health Awareness Month. Using things like, movies, television, whatever it might be, because so often I see depictions of therapy and therapists that are very cringeworthy. So having an accurate portrayal of how, that type of session might go, or just what the relationship can be like between therapist and client or patient or veteran or whatever. But so I was, just beyond honored that he felt like that was part of the story worth telling. And then for any, person, veteran, anybody who's willing to open themselves up to say, Yes, I have received therapy. I do this. This is something that I've needed. I think breaking down that stigma is just going to help more people get help and get better. So I'm delighted.
Couldn't agree more. And we were honored to have you part of that program last fall. Well, Katie, you did it. You're now the May Inspiring Story of Service. Thanks for your insight and letting us get to know you a little better today. And thank you to everyone for joining us here for our Inspiring Story of Service. You can always go to our website at nationalvmm.org to access all our stories on our stories page. And if you're a veteran or a service member who's struggling, or a family member of a veteran struggling with mental health, we have a wonderful resources page on our website as well. And you can always contact your nearest Veteran Affairs office for support. And that's what a little glimpse of what our museum does. This is what we do. We tell the stories, but we also connect everyone to make even sometimes the smallest impact on their mental wellness, their physical wellness, or their connection back to their family as well, and their service. So Katie, thanks again for being a part of our story this month, and we'll keep tabs on you. We'll connect again, I'm sure.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Throughout our 120 years, Ford has supported our nation's armed forces and honored their selfless service to our country. The Central Ohio Ford dealers are proud to continue this tradition by investing in the work of the National Veterans Memorial and Museum in Columbus. Together, we want to share the veterans' heroic stories and introduce a grateful nation to the faces behind our forces. Please join us this year to hear inspiring educational stories from our veterans who have gone above and beyond their call to defend freedom around the world. The National Veterans Memorial and Museum and your Central Ohio Ford dealers. Together, we will never forget.